enough of a margin for them to satisfy Wall Street.
I am so grateful and so amazed and happy that RAM is here and put this on, because there are so many people like myself that don't have health care.
I became a doctor to help people. I became a doctor because I want to look after people in the best possible way. And mostly I wanted to be a doctor in the NHS because I can make those decisions without ever having to think about how much that person earns or insurance qualifications.
The Thatcher regime certainly put in an important amount of the preparation for privatisation, but in order to pull off the whole plan, it was necessary to put it in the hands of a business-friendly opposition party.
We've never voted on the privatisation of the health service, it's just happened in subterfuge. It's happened by demonising people who work in the health service, like the junior doctors who are presented as not wanting to give up their weekends. I mean, what a lie that is.
It is in the sights and the target of the multinational corporations.
I think everything with a trade deal is on the table, so NHS or anything else, or a lot more than that.
This is the story of the Great NHS Heist.
We didn't have societies where certain things were guaranteed. When people don't have a certain level of security, they can be attracted to extremist ideologies of one sort or another. I think that was the thinking of the people in Europe at the time who created the welfare state. And there was also a certain fear, and I think that's important to bear in mind, that they really were afraid of revolution. They had this population coming back from war, trained in the use of weapons, and had every reason to not want to see the status quo of the 30s restored.
Round about the turn of the 19th century, we had an insurance system, a national insurance system put in place to pay for healthcare, but that was really not very satisfactory. Lots of bureaucracy, lots of people were left out of the system. But by the end of the Second World War, there was a possibility open politically for a claim for the people of this country to have a proper health system that covered everybody.
It didn't exist. It was announced it was going to exist. It didn't come into being until 1948. But the most telling thing is the absolute collapse of the suicide rate of elderly people in the years before the NHS began, because you no longer had to kill yourself, so you were not a burden on your children, because you knew it was coming.
At the end of the 1940s, for the first time, women could get antenatal care without financial penalty. And so they began to be seen regularly, and people began to see the harbingers of the deaths from preeclampsia. And in 1952, a paper was very, very good. It would never be published now. But it was a landmark paper. It just said, if women start showing the signs of preeclampsia, get them into hospital. If the signs get too violent, get them delivered. The answer is to get them delivered in time. This was implemented in the 1950s, and the maternal mortality, which was then being audited very carefully by the triennial inquiries into maternal death, did its biggest documented fall in the history of preeclampsia.
I decided I really wanted to go nursing, and as the new hospital opened up in my part of the world, opened by Honora in Bevan when the health service was first established in July 1948, it all seemed to be such an exciting prospect.
People don't present with great illness deliberately. And so it makes sense to treat people on the basis of their need, not on the basis of who can pay. It was the beginning of the end of fear. And it was an idea that you're all part of something that you hoped you would preferably never have to use, or at least use as least as possible. It's a brilliant idea. It's a stroke of genius.
You had family doctors at the heart of every community. If they needed to, they could refer patients to hospital specialists. It also set up a collaborative ethos which led to major medical breakthroughs. It was a very successful system and copied across the world in countries like Spain, Italy, and also in Scandinavia.
It proves beyond reasonable doubt that public health provided freely at the point of delivery is far more efficient than anything the private sector can produce. If you compare the percentage of national income that goes to national health to health generally here in Britain with what goes on in other countries like the United States, you can see that even if you only care about efficiency, the National Health Service should be preserved like a jewel.
Taking the edge off of the radical insecurity of life was very much something that people felt as a social responsibility, as opposed to the neoliberal regime that comes afterwards, which is really about increasing the degree of uncertainty we have in life and turning that into a weapon.
At the end of the 70s, Margaret Thatcher came in and decided that the only way to restore profitability to capitalism was to make the workforce more vulnerable, allowing unemployment to go through the roof by withdrawing subsidies to some industries, factories closed, and laws against trade unions. And another element was in allowing capital to take back control of the big industries that we had all owned. So electricity, water, gas, the mines, the railways, eventually they all went back to private capital. And then where else do you look? Well, you look to the public services. And the prime target was the National Health Service.
When she talked about trying to sort of privatise the NHS, as Nigel Lawson described it, it led to I think what he described as a cabinet riot, and the idea was abandoned. But they then decided they'd do it incrementally.
Conservative Party documents from 1977, 2 years before they took office, revealed plans to privatise the utilities. Key elements were to proceed by stealth, fragmenting public monopolies, allowing the sale of assets, and the creation of separate profit centres.
Sir Keith Joseph started a think tank called the Centre for Policy Studies, and that commissioned John Redwood and Oliver Letwin, both at the time involved with N.M. Rothschild's Investment Bank's privatisation unit. It commissioned the pair of them to produce a prescription for what should happen to the NHS. So, along the lines of Oliver Letwin's book the same year, Privatising the World, in the CPS pamphlet, Britain's Biggest Enterprise, Letwin and Redwood laid out how the NHS could be transformed into a privatised model which would be much, much more profitable for the private sector.
In the late 70s, we had the emergence of a new economic ideology known as neoliberalism or trickle-down economics. And this was adopted in this country by Margaret Thatcher and in America by Ronald Reagan. And it boiled down to three main pillars: privatisation, deregulation, and also tax cuts for the rich. With NHS privatisation, Margaret Thatcher realised this would be deeply unpopular because the NHS is well respected, close to a national religion. So they set about doing this incrementally, starting first of all with non-medical services like cleaning and catering. And the next major step in the privatisation was the introduction of a market bureaucracy.
Before the internal market was first introduced by Kenneth Clarke, the NHS was brilliantly efficient. It spent just 4%, 4 pence in the pound on administration. And it now spends somewhere between 12 and 15% in the pound. That's more than £10 billion a year extra going on running the contracting system. Money utterly down the drain.
The Thatcher regime certainly put in an important amount of the preparation for privatisation, but in order to pull off the whole plan, it was necessary to put it in the hands of a business-friendly opposition party.
It will be a government that seeks to restore trust in politics in this country.
The Labour government under Blair and Brown are prime culprits because they increased the privatisation of the health service, the subcontracting, the outsourcing.
Tony Blair was very critical of the market in the NHS, but when he got elected, he embraced privatisation. He carried on the Thatcher plan. For the first time ever, we had the outsourcing of medical services in the early 2000s. This was a major breach of fundamental principles of the NHS, which was public provision of healthcare.
The private sector was creaming off or cherry picking. They were doing simpler, less risky, less costly operations on people who were generally fairly healthy, leaving the NHS to do some of those, but also to do all the complex operations and deal with the people who were really, really poorly and people who were permanently poorly, as well as providing accident emergency services and doing all the training.
Cleaning was outsourced. The NHS medical teams lost control of cleanliness in the hospitals, and the consequence has been uncontrollable antibiotic-resistant infections like MRSA, which has now run rife through the NHS.
We saw the collapse of the Circle contract to run the Hinchingbrooke Hospital, couldn't make enough profit. They had a damning inspection report and walked away. Musgrove Park Hospital, there was a contract for Vanguard to provide cataract surgery. They had a 50% complication rate and some patients were left blind. And recently we've had Carillion, which has collapsed, leaving a £7 billion black hole. Hospital projects like the Royal Liverpool Hospital left unfinished and walked away from providing multiple public service contracts. Directors leaving with millions of payout in their back pocket and the public left to pick up the pieces.
The outsourcing of non-medical services and repurposing the NHS into a business was followed by the imposition of an internal market. Financial destabilization with private debt and the expansion of outsourcing to core service provision then transitioned in 2012 into a full compulsory external market. Hospitals now free to earn half their income from private patients. By 2014, the essential covert groundwork was completed ahead of the final phase, converting the NHS into an American-style accountable care model and privatizing control of NHS budgets.
Any medical system which is based primarily on a principle of competition is going to be a disaster. If there's anything which lends itself to the notion of absolute, unconditional, and uniform treatment of people, it's something like that. We don't want to have impulses of greed to be validated within a structure which is based on the opposite principles. Once you say it's okay to think about your own interest above those of others, that starts infecting everybody and undermines the very project which you're originally involved in.
You could get people to work well over the hours they were being paid because they knew they were part of something that was good. I mean, I don't think that was completely deliberate, but in hindsight, when somebody really cares about something, they do a much better job than when they're just trying to get money. And so the NHS actually got a greater amount of efficiency out of the staff than any other system ever can.
One of the senior nursing managers asked me towards the end of my career, how did I plan the service that had developed, which had a certain presence in the country. The people had heard about it as being a landmark service. And the answer is, it wasn't planned. You worked day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year, and you saw the needs and you adapted to meet the needs.
The old structure of the NHS really wasn't fit for purpose for privatisation because it consisted largely of dedicated doctors. So those have been shoved out sideways, and the NHS management has been replaced by a private sector-friendly, entrepreneurial lot of people who don't have much in the way of medical skills, but they do go along with the privatisation ideas.
New public management essentially is based on two elements. If you boil it down to its simplest parts, one is customer choice or consumer choice, and the other is the measurement of services to enable customers to make that choice. So ostensibly, it's supposed to introduce a market discipline into the public sector by allowing a series of measures that people can use to make choices, right? So league tables, performance indicators, they're all central to the new public management. And you see that obviously in the NHS, you see it in education, you see it in public transport. This is all about transparency, about creating transparency. What it does in reality is actually distort the relationship between the service provider and the service user.
There was one manager in the maternity unit when I first joined it, and one secretary. They did the management. Now the whole floor is full of managers. They're everywhere.
So there is a rump of technicians, accountants, and managers that have power now.
I was in charge of the accident emergency department, the orthopaedic fracture clinic, the plaster room, and the pain clinic. So I was involved in a number of meetings where I would defend the accident emergency department, stand up for the local community, and that was clearly painful from their point of view because they were unable to make the changes they want to.
Their anger and their protest is not just for baby P, and it is no longer confined to the streets of Haringey.
The death of baby P is one of the most high-profile tragedies of the past decade. Peter Connolly, the blue-eyed, blonde-haired little boy, was found dead in his cot in the North London borough of Haringey in 2007. The little boy had more than 50 injuries to his body. 2 days before his death, a children's doctor who was standing in as a locum missed the fact that the child had a broken spine.
I was working as one of 4 paediatricians in Haringey within the community paediatric team. In the year before baby P, there were some budget cuts, so there was some cost improvements, and one of our consultants, who was the named doctor, his post was cut from the team. So there were 3 of us left at that point. There was no support from senior management, and the whole working environment became increasingly hostile. There was a locum doctor in post who had very inadequate training and supervision in terms of child protection. So it was a sort of accident waiting to happen.
We had a patient in the corridor who had a respiratory arrest. I had to move somebody out of resus into the corridor to be able to put this patient into there. We had paediatric emergencies, patients in the waiting room with chest pain that we were unable to move through. We had a telephone call from one of the paramedics who was at the house of a lady who'd given birth to a baby on the bathroom floor. They couldn't get an ambulance to the scene. She really didn't know what to do. And so between us, we'd negotiated not only the stabilisation of the baby, but actually coming into the department, and the baby survived. I finished an 18-hour shift and I walked home. I sat at the end of the kitchen table and just sobbed.
So corporate cultures are designed to allow the people making decisions to justify decisions that they would never be able to live with otherwise. Because you have to say, look, it's not my money. I have to do what will be maximally profitable to the shareholders. Of course, the shareholders have no say. So the executive who's actually making the decision has to behave in a rational, calculating, and ultimately pathological fashion. If I have to do something that might poison a lot of babies, well, I feel bad about that, but it isn't really my responsibility. Introducing that kind of logic into an enterprise, which is about providing care for people, creates utterly toxic contradictions.
One of the more insidious aspects of this new public management performance culture is the distortion that leads to corruption. And that's because people are under so much pressure to attain those results that there's a strain, sociologists would call it a strain, between the ability to achieve those results legitimately and their inability to practically achieve those results. And that strain leads to league tables and to performance indicators being falsified.
When they brought in the 4-hour target, this random figure that they had plucked from the air that they measured quality with, it had no measurement of quality at all. 4 hours and 1 minute was a failure. Managers would come down to my department and go through the casualty cards, documentation, trying to get me to readjust the timings on them.
Initially, I thought, because baby P had happened, that there would be some investigation, some inquiry, and that the employer, who was Great Ormond Street, would recognise that there were the issues that we'd been talking about, the staffing issues, the infrastructure issues, and the system problems with, in terms of how we work with social services, etc. The serious case review was a flawed process in that representation from health was not honest and transparent. Representation from health was saying our department is satisfactory. This was challenged, and it was subsequently found that an independent assessment of the department by the Royal College of Paediatrics had found our department to be clinically unsafe. That report was edited out of information submitted to the serious case review.
Hundreds of parents are demanding urgent, far-reaching changes in social services.
Media attention and subsequent public outcry over the tragic death of baby Peter wrongly focused on Haringey social services and the locum doctor, rather than where responsibility truly lay, with the NHS leadership at Great Ormond Street Hospital. As a result of damaging staff cuts in pursuit of government policy, the scandal of poor care in Mid Staffordshire Hospital was spun into scapegoating the nursing staff for their lack of compassion. Both the government and NHS senior management have mutual self-interest in covering up failings and misdirecting blame in order to protect themselves and to continue with their damaging reforms. Patients and relatives are denied justice and accountability by this toxic corporate culture, as witnessed again in the Gosport Memorial Hospital scandal, where hundreds of patients were killed with medically unjustifiable morphine overdoses.
When things go wrong and people speak out, it is for these senior members of staff to listen, to hear and to make change, not to actually then put people on this horrendous roundabout, which is 20 years for us, and not actually make that difference for what is, something that's very, very important for patient safety.
Suddenly I'm told, actually, we don't need you anymore. At a time when they were very short of doctors, please accept an offer of compensation, and good luck. What I discovered is the offer of compensation was not without its cost, and the cost was that I was expected to sign a gagging clause. There was clearly some cover-up, lack of transparency and a lack of integrity amongst senior leaders in the NHS. We can't be sure that if you speak up in the NHS that you will be protected, and that's very evident from a number of cases that are currently going through the courts.
Within weeks of the Francis inquiry into the Mid Staffordshire Hospital scandal, which recommended better treatment of NHS whistleblowers, Dr. Christay raised concerns regarding unsafe staffing levels in the intensive care unit at Queen Elizabeth Hospital. His medical career was terminated, leading to a protracted legal battle, costing the taxpayer over £700,000, preventing his case from being heard, and in the process, removing whistleblowing protection from all junior doctors in the country until this was overturned in the Court of Appeal. Following the tragic death of 6-year-old Jack Adcock in Leicester Royal Infirmary as a result of multiple system failures and compounded by human error, Dr. Bawa Garba was convicted of gross negligence manslaughter in 2015. Frontline staff face possible retribution if they raise concerns and risk criminal prosecution, trying to do their best in the overstretched NHS.
My clinical experience within the NHS changed quite dramatically from going away of involving clinicians in decision-making, in making sure that the decision was based on quality and care. It was very much driven by finance, by non-clinicians, an air of intimidation. You will face the retribution, the wrath of the senior managers. And my colleagues experience that on a regular basis.
Every successive reform of the NHS has provided the government with an opportunity to mould the leadership into an obedient structure that will just carry out policy without question. People who are seen as an obstacle are removed and replaced by the very vested interests that are going to profit out of the privatisation.
They told me I was being disciplined because I'd allowed the 27-week gestation baby to come into the department. I should have refused access. I should have allowed the baby to die in the patient's bathroom. After I was disciplined and I was demoted, my colleagues stopped fighting. They were frightened of being disciplined and going through the same experience that I had. They took away my vocation. They took away the whole reason, I suppose, that I gave my life to the NHS. 41 years of dedicated service.
If you are taking public money to run a public service, you need to run it with a degree of social care and conscience, and that's what's gone missing.
Health and Social Care Act 2012 relies on a new mechanism called clinical commissioning groups. And those are new entities set up within the NHS which control the money that can be spent by the NHS. So the infrastructure is put in the Health and Social Care Act 2012 to create state-owned health maintenance organisations. These health maintenance organisations are copied from the private sector arrangements in US healthcare, and now those will be available to be fully privatised and passed over to control of the American insurance industry.
I never expected to actually get very involved in health policy, but what I found relatively early in my training is that the irrationality of our healthcare system drove me to get involved in issues of healthcare financing. As a trainee, I saw enormous numbers of patients who couldn't get the care that they needed, and yet it was in a community with a surplus of medical resources.
You would never look at this country and say we want to have what the United States has, because it is at the same time the most expensive healthcare system in the world, and also one of the most inequitable, and one in which quality of care is not as good as most other Western countries. And we also have still about 30 million people who live in this country who don't have insurance, who don't have access to care.
Where the patients at the public hospital, mostly poor and many of them Black, couldn't get even the most basic things often. Across the town a mile away, people were getting not just what they needed, but often things that they didn't need and were really assaultive medical care.
People with insurance still can have a lot of trouble affording care in the United States, since it's very common to have huge co-payments and deductibles that you have to pay at the time of use. A lot of the plans in the Obamacare exchanges have deductibles of up to $5,000 per person. The average deductible for someone who gets their health insurance through their employer is about $1,400. So that's money that you have to take out of your pocket if you get sick and pay before the insurance even kicks in.
The insurance industry, the drug companies have all fought any efforts to change the system in any way that would get us closer to a universal single-payer system. And the reason for that is that the system works very, very well for some. It works very well for the insurance companies, it works very well for the big hospital systems, and it works exceedingly well for drug companies in the United States, but very dysfunctional for many millions of Americans.
The American healthcare system is made up of insurance companies, hospital provider chains, drug and medical appliance companies, and the government. The profit motive is the driving force, and for insurers, money can be made by the denial of care and high out-of-pocket expenses before insurance claims can be made. Hospital providers inflate charges and carry out unnecessary tests and treatments, then bill the patients, insurers, or the government. Drug and appliance manufacturers push up their prices, heavily market and exaggerate the benefits of their products. Some of those excluded by privatized healthcare are supported by government funding, Medicare for the elderly, and Medicaid for the poor and the young. But government funding mostly goes to private providers and insurers.
The literature is quite large and quite compelling that if people have to take money out of their pocket to see a doctor, they'll do it much less often. They'll see the doctor much less often, even in critical situations like a heart attack.
If you look at the death rates of people who are uninsured and compare them to comparable people who have insurance, that each year about 1 in 1,000 people who lack insurance will die because of that lack of insurance. So of the 29 million people who are uninsured this year, about 29,000 of them will die unnecessarily because they lack coverage.
The youngest and the healthiest in this country were charged the least premium, but as people grew older, and certainly got into their 50s and early 60s, insurance became, in many cases, prohibitively expensive. A lot of their health insurance is employer-based, so a lot of people were insulated from that experience if they were able to keep a job at a company that offered benefits. But what we have seen over the past several years is that employers are shifting more and more of the cost of health insurance and health care to their workers.
The theory says that the consumer has to have equal knowledge to the seller. And obviously the patient can't have equal knowledge to the seller of healthcare. The consumer has to be able to exit if they don't like what the seller is offering. So if you have a broken leg, you're not in a position to shop among accident departments.
The view that markets are going to make your healthcare system more efficient flies in the face of the international evidence. The United States does have the developed world's most market-oriented healthcare system, and our costs per capita are about twice what they are in the rest of the developed world.
When we first moved to Boston, we went by the billing department of the largest hospital in Boston, so it's a 900-bed tertiary care referral center, and their billing department at that time was 352 full-time persons.
Over the last 40 years, the number of doctors in the American health system has doubled. However, over the same period of time, the number of administrators has increased exponentially by a staggering 30-fold.
President Obama actually said in an early interview that one reason he doesn't want to have a national health style system or a single payer insurance system is that it would eliminate unnecessary jobs. He said, what are we going to do? We have 3 million people working for Blue Cross Blue Shield or Kaiser. You know, what are we going to put those guys?
Well, fraud is really ubiquitous in a for-profit corporate healthcare system, and these giant corporations, they get caught in fraud and they pay the ticket and keep on speeding.
In 2002, following a 5-year investigation into allegations of fraud, including overbilling government Medicare, paying kickbacks to doctors, and falsifying records, Health Corporation of America agreed to settle, paying over $2 billion in what was then the largest settlement in U.S. corporate history.
They, of course, make the most money by charging high premiums and delivering the least care. So they're constantly trying to avoid sick people. When they do get sick people, they try and make them look sicker so they can collect a higher premium for them. The line between what's fraudulent and what's normal practice is an indistinct line.
The insurance industry will tell you, they'll cite statistics that they pay for well over 90% of all the claims that they get. The reality is that's probably true because so many of them are fairly small and routine. But a lot of the ones that are denied are the ones that cost the most money, or the treatment costs the most money. It could be cancer care. It could be a liver transplant. A lot of the people who got their policies canceled by the insurance companies, by the way, before Obamacare, before the Affordable Care Act was passed, were women with breast cancer. And the insurance companies would review their files and come up with some phony reason to avoid paying for their care. You've got to realize that these companies are in the business to make money. And to make money, they have to take in more money in premiums than they pay out in care. There always has to be enough of a margin for them to satisfy Wall Street.
Starting about 30 years ago now, Medicare said, well, if the elderly want to sign up for private insurance, we'll pay their premium. And of course, what they discovered was the insurance company said, well, we'll sign up healthy people, and they bring us a premium and cost us very little. So Medicare, the public agency, tried to risk adjust to pay more for sicker people and less for healthy people. And the insurance companies have now had a huge effort to try and make people look sicker than they actually are. So some of that is outright illegal, some is legal but despicable.
In 2017, the US government joined a lawsuit filed by former United Health Group finance director turned whistleblower Benjamin Poling. United Health is alleged to have violated the False Claims Act with regard to taxpayer-funded Medicare, amounting to hundreds of millions of dollars. United Health fully contests the allegation, and the case is ongoing.
On the hospital side, they play similar games. They try and make the patients look sicker and bring in higher fees. And they've been repeatedly cited for this kind of fraudulent behavior. They were literally kidnapping psychiatric patients and holding them against their will until the day their insurance ran out, and then they would eject them.
The most common cause of bankruptcy in America is medical debt. You know, people are terrified that their lives are going to be destroyed because someone they care about is going to become sick. And they have these terrible choices between, you know, what am I going to do? I have to, you know, it's my sister, it's my mother, it's someone I love. I can't let them die. But since the system apparently is perfectly happy with letting them die, you know, essentially your life gets sucked away. And people have to make these devil's bargains. Sometimes they won't do it and they have to feel guilty for the rest of their lives. They feel they've effectively killed someone by not selling their house to be able to provide the medical services. Other times they do it and then they have to secretly resent people for the rest of their lives. It's a terrible, terrible situation to put people in.
Medical bills are the cause of 60% of household bankruptcy in America, and more than 3/4 of these bankrupt families had medical insurance.
People who are relatively well off, who are paying for a very expensive and supposedly good coverage, when they come down to it, what they find is the small print often cuts them out of care at the time they need it most. They find out that there are limits. You have your cancer, and after several years of successful treatment, you run out of cover.
I do hear about this in terms of maternity care, because in the preeclampsia field, one of the biggest problems is that crises happen very quickly and they can be lethal. So the system that was developed in the early 1950s was to keep people in hospital when they had the problems. But in the United States, they don't do that. And as soon as they're in and they're thought to be, by the doctor, to be at risk, the insurance rings up and says, you've got to send this woman home. So they're deciding, not the doctor.
Despite being the world's richest country with the most expensive healthcare, America has the highest number of maternal deaths of any developed country. Figures from 2015 show for every 100,000 live births, more than 26 American mothers will die, almost 3 times higher than in Britain.
Well, it puts people in a tremendous bind because really, I think very few of our colleagues went into medicine with the idea that they were going to do such morally repugnant things.
Keep in mind that a medical director is just as much of a corporate employee as I was. And we're always made aware, we're constantly made aware of the need to make sure that our investors were happy. You want to make sure that you get a bonus. You want to make sure that you get a raise. You know that the chances of your getting a bonus or a raise are enhanced if you help the company achieve earnings goals.
There is one group of people who do extremely well out of the American healthcare system. In 2016 alone, the top 6 health insurance company chief executive officers each earned upwards of $17 million. Former United Health Group CEO Dr. Bill McGuire received an outgoing compensation package worth in excess of $1 billion.
Death panels actually do exist in this country. They exist within private insurance companies. The insurance company employees have the power over life and death.
And in fact, the American system, taxpayers pay more per head for health care than we do in this country, despite the fact that they're also paying for private care. In a sense, there's a certain generosity in the American system. People are paying double. There's a certain stupidity as well, because what they're paying for is wasted and goes into profit.
When Michael Moore decided to make a movie on the healthcare industry.
One of my responsibilities was to ultimately discredit Michael Moore as a filmmaker and the film itself.
The intent is to maximize profits.
You denied more people health care, you got a bonus.
When you don't spend money on somebody, it's a savings to the company.
But as I watched the film, I was really affected by it. I could tell that he did the film very carefully. I saw no inaccuracies. Yes, he had an agenda, certainly, but his depiction of how health insurance companies operated was dead on. Back home from Philadelphia to visit family in Tennessee, and I just picked up a newspaper and read about something called a healthcare expedition that was being held close to where I grew up in Wise County, Virginia, across the state line a few miles. I'd never heard of the organization Remote Area Medical that was putting this on. When I went to that fair, I saw the real consequences of the actions and the practices of my industry.
When I came to this country, I found that, gosh, there's millions of people here that don't have access or can't afford the care that they need. And so that's when I formed Remote Area Medical.
Yesterday morning, we were out at 2:30. There was already over 100 people waiting to come in. People with kids, grandparents.
They opened the parking lot at midnight. I was pleasantly surprised. They give you a number for your car when you come in. You wait until 3 o'clock in the morning, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, they begin handing out numbers to the individuals in the car that designate what order you get in the door.
We don't ask questions about, do you have a job? Are you from this country, or are you here legally or illegally? We don't ask any of those questions, and the patients really appreciate that. We just ask, where does it hurt? This morning, one lady came up to me. She was in the line. She said, I need to have my teeth fixed. I said, well, very glad to have you here. We'll see what we can do. She said, I've got insurance, but it doesn't cover dental. And also, I can't afford to go to the doctor anyway because the deductible is like $900.
Most of the folks that I've been talking to today agreed that healthcare is pretty broken. We have a lot of folks here. There's a large age range from very small children to very elderly people, conservative, liberal, people in the middle. Pretty much everyone that I've talked to has had a very similar situation to mine where they are insured, but the insurance doesn't cover certain services, or they happen to be underinsured or in between something, or taking care of family members and they don't have enough money to pay for their own co-pays.
Last year, there was a single mom who lived in the state of Texas who had very serious dental problems and was told that until the infection of her dental problem went either to her heart or her brain, she couldn't be cared for. Another one last year was just a great little young guy who was a 6th grader in school. And he got a pair of glasses, and he was just jubilant. He went around just wanting to show everybody his glasses. And somebody said, well, let me see those. And they were rather thick glasses. He said, well, how long has it been since you've had a new pair of glasses? He says, I haven't been able to read for the last 3 years. So here's a 6th grader who hasn't been able to read for 3 years. And I made the determination that, you know, we're better than that. We're just better than that.
Well, my husband and I have had a very, very difficult year, losing our jobs, losing almost everything, actually. And so we don't have health insurance. My immediate need was to see a dentist because yesterday I didn't have any of these teeth here. I have a really, really bad time with my wrist with arthritis, and they were able to help me with that. They also gave me a voucher to go get a free mammogram. I'm 45, it's about that time. But I am so grateful and so blessed and so amazed and happy that RAM is here and put this on, because there are so many people like myself that don't have health care. We don't have insurance. Even when you are employed here in the States, it doesn't mean you get health care. And most people hire you part-time so they don't have to give you health insurance.
We're set up on a Friday and we treat patients on Saturday and Sunday. And do 1,000 or so patients during that period. The saddest part of this job is that we always have to turn people away.
I would love to see us as a society, and don't know how we get there, and don't know what that looks like, where I was out of a job, that I no longer had to come and volunteer and do this, and I could be doing something else. But until we get to the point in this country where there's free access, universal access for everybody, unfortunately, Stan and the rest of us volunteers will be here for many years.
People here in the United States who think that we're talking about socialized a solution, they need to get over that.
Something like 70% of the American people are in favor of a single-payer system. The problem is entirely the fact that there is just so much money tied up in it that at every stage the politicians can be bought. It's not that different than Britain, but it's cheaper.
When we write to our MP or you sign a petition, you're trying to affect the government decisions. The problem is surrounding this commercial lobbying industry, and these are people who are paid often, in fact ordinarily, by companies in the financial sector to influence government. Most of it is hidden. It includes everybody from paid lobbyists working in PR agencies to think tanks. There are law firms that lobby, management consultancies, Big Four accountancy firms. It is quite a diverse but quite a big industry.
It clearly does not make any sense to dismantle a reasonably well-functioning public service to replace it with something inferior. So the privatisation industry went into overtime on its marketing spend, and it came up with some excellent ideas for talking people round into what has indeed proved to be a fairly disastrous course. Those focused very much on the idea of private sector efficiency coming to the rescue of the NHS. What, of course, people failed to note at the time was that what is efficient for the private sector in terms of extracting money from the public sector is nothing short of a disaster for that public sector.
The cost of management consultants in the NHS has more than doubled, from £300 million in 2009 to over £640 million by 2014, and it continues to grow.
What the Big Four accounting firms do is really quite deadly. Deadly in the sense that people are deprived of essential, crucial social services, but they also disable the state.
It may be that there is less bribery, or there's less extortive corruption, for example, in Britain. But actually the levels of collusive corruption, and by that I mean corruption that involves institutional benefit, sometimes individual benefit, but not necessarily money changing hands, but people and institutions colluding for mutual benefit, is absolutely rife.
The first thing that any lobbyist needs is access to politicians. You need to be in the room making decisions, and they, with the decision maker, and they have realised that the easiest way of doing that is to find somebody who's just come out of the room. They are snapped up and then employed as lobbyists, and they've got the insider knowledge of how government works, and they've got the contacts. They know how that minister thinks and how best to approach that minister, and all the subtleties that you could never know from the outside. It has been very prevalent. It's been very common for a health minister to leave, and then it can be a matter of months later take up a job in the corporate sector.
Alan Milburn, Patricia Hewitt, and also Stephen Dorrell, who was my Tory predecessor. They are have all been working for companies involved in benefiting from the privatisation of the NHS.
One of the problems that we found, and it was particularly acute, we found it during the passage of the Health and Social Care Bill, was the fact that there were so many MPs and Lords who had a direct financial interest in what was happening with these reforms. You know, these are people deciding and signing off on policy and pushing these ideas through and supposed to be representing us.
If we look at what they're earning after they leave office and look at the totality of their earnings attributable to their time in office, that gives you a very different picture. And when they move to corporations, when they move to regulators, when they move into other roles, then they can exert often much more influence.
Democracy has almost evaporated. Democracy has become essentially a system of institutionalized bribery. And I think that this is one reason why you have these outbursts like Brexit or Donald Trump nowadays, that they're essentially protest votes in the classic sense of the term. I think that someone like Donald Trump is a gigantic middle finger directed at the political class of America. Essentially, people are saying, like, this is what we think of you, Bozo the clown. We're going to elect him as president because essentially we think you're all a bunch of clowns anyway. At least this guy admits it.
That it's so easy to catch a politician willing to do whatever, ask questions, influence something in exchange for cash, suggests that there is a culture within Parliament, particularly in the House of Lords, I'd say, where this is normal behaviour.
Over 200 parliamentarians were able to vote through the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government's 2012 Health and Social Care Act, despite the fact they had financial links to private healthcare companies.
The major newspapers are owned by billionaires. They all are by, I looked this up not long ago, they're all tax exiled billionaires. So they have a particular way of approaching social cohesion.
The press around the world has concentrated on Britain because it's a kind of token. If you can keep Britain neoliberal and to the far right, then you can sort of shine the torch. And also, by the way, you can keep control of all the treasure islands. You've got to remember that Britain guarantees the sovereignty of where the rich hide their money and don't pay tax.
One of the things that we always did was spend a lot of time testing words and phrases to determine which would have the most emotional impact on people. And that's why we use terms like socialized medicine or slippery slope towards socialized medicine or government takeover of healthcare. We knew those terms would connect with people emotionally. At the heart of all of this is our efforts to scare people away from reform. Even though we had a growing number of Americans who were uninsured, we created a campaign to get people to think that they were unworthy.
The media have really failed to scrutinize this process. The right-wing press, of course, believe in it, so they wouldn't scrutinize it. They'd applaud it. They represent capital. They represent the interests of big business, and this is opportunities for big business. They talk about setting the health service free, and they talk about initiating a serious debate on funding, and that's code for sell it off to the private sector.
The biggest lie, of course, is that the NHS is unsustainable. But they're also producing other myths around the ageing population, health tourism, but perhaps the most toxic line they're pursuing is that of the undeserving sick, blaming illness on the patient.
We also created front groups to perpetuate these myths. They essentially are purported to be grassroots organizations, but they are, another term for them is AstroTurf, because they are not grassroots. They're fake grassroots organizations. But they're cast as, or the industry wants people to believe that citizens actually came together to create these groups and that these groups represent the interests of regular folks. One in particular that we used during the healthcare reform debate was Healthcare America. Sounds patriotic, doesn't it? The insurance industry and the pharmaceutical industry provided the funding to a PR firm to create Healthcare America. And even reporters are fooled by these.
At the crucial time when the reforms were going through, there were two groups that popped up. There was Doctors for Reform and Nurses for Reform, both tied to free market think tanks, one of whom we could see was being funded by the private health insurers. And what you would get is, I mean, it was brilliant, absolutely brilliant, because you've got doctors, and I think she was a nurse, in the mainstream media, and people trust them.
We've had more protests in this country last year, maybe it was the year before, than any year since 1972. The difference is that you wouldn't know it from the news. They just don't talk about it anymore. Nowadays, they've realized that if you just pretend it isn't happening, it's very demoralizing. We have an ideology that works not because people think that the system is fair, because people falsely believe that everybody else thinks it's fair. Everybody's sitting there saying, well, you know, I know it's fixed, I know the game is fixed, but these other people are stupid. I mean, look at people, they believe this nonsense, they're sheep. So everybody thinks that everybody else isn't thinking the same thing.
We've seen a series of legal changes, each of which has its own compelling narrative explaining why the step is being taken, but each of which actually just moves us further and further towards the final privatised state for the NHS by means of the different mechanisms that Letwin set out in privatising the world.
Is it all going to plan with the Naylor review and the land grab? We've got Project Phoenix now, haven't we, with the land grab and...
I don't want to have an interview, thank you very much.
Initially developed by the Conservative government in the early 1990s, but massively expanded by the Blair government, and even before Labour came to power in 1997, I do recall a meeting of, it was called the Labour Finance and Industry Group. It was kind of a think tank set up by the Labour Party, and I was asked to join. I was horrified. One day, John Prescott came and with this idea of PFI, which I believe had been sold to him by Anderson Consulting, and one of its senior managers also became a well-known Labour MP and subsequently a health secretary. And they thought it was basically free money because the borrowing, essentially through PFI you are borrowing because private sector is investing, that this borrowing would not show up in the government figures. Somehow Labour would miraculously invest more in the public services.
It was never a particularly good idea, but as the Treasury and the Auditor General said, it was a bargain. As far as I was concerned, I was the health minister. I wanted to get some hospitals built, and the only way I was going to get hospitals built was via the private finance initiative.
I told politicians at that time, and still believe that that is really fool's gold. There is no such thing as free money. All that happened is that the government ended up guaranteeing corporate profits.
The private financiers then own the building, and the National Health Service has the equivalent of a mortgage for 20 or 30 years and ends up paying many, many times the cost of the building. That's a drain of our taxes into the pockets of the private speculators.
They looked at the state as a place where they could spin off profitable investments, and the private finance initiative fits very closely into that mould. Gordon Brown actually sold it in that way. He famously said to a group of private investors, here you have a protected income stream, an income stream guaranteed by government. Where else can you find another business opportunity like it?
PFI has been a scam. It's a bit like being forced to sell your own house, move into an overpriced hotel, and having to pay for everything on a credit card.
The adoption of PFI planted debt time bombs across the NHS. The national network of hospitals started to be broken up into foundation trusts. Public bodies are backed by the taxpayer and cannot go bankrupt. So it was necessary in 2006 to introduce new insolvency regulations, setting hospitals up for asset stripping. The Trust Special Administrator was created in 2009 and was deployed for the first time in 2012, just as the growing PFI burden caused South London Healthcare Trust to flounder as intended, so its assets could then be sold off.
The income schedules for those PFI debts were set to rise inexorably until finally they pull the hospital into bankruptcy, where it will be allowed to be sold under the 2006 law about unsustainable providers.
The popular local maternity unit at Queen Mary's Hospital, publicly owned and debt-free, was closed and demolished to pay for South London Healthcare Trust's PFI debts. In its place now stand private apartments, returning profits for their developers, while pregnant mothers are forced to travel further for care, a pattern replicated across the country.
It's cost us our nurses and our doctors. And how is it paid for? Well, one thing is they withdraw the bursaries for student nurses. So we have no nurses. So then they've got to hire agency nurses at many times the cost of nurses that we have trained. What nonsense, what corrupt stupidity.
The total PFI capital investment in the NHS to date is £12 billion, and over the whole lifetime of those PFIs, the total repayments will be about £88 billion.
Deloitte, the accountants, have produced the Naylor Review, which sets out how NHS trusts will be incentivised to flog off their land. In the heart of the City of London, offices set up by the government company PropCo are there to asset strip the NHS, hollow out the NHS, and provide investment opportunities for the world's richest people.
The NHS is not for sale, and it never will be.
Some people say data is the new oil, but definitely, you know, data is, especially personal data, is one of the greatest commodities of our time. With the boom in big data, artificial intelligence, algorithmic decision making, there is a whole new market expanding and booming.
After the 2012 Act, Health and Social Care Act, GP colleagues from that period sort of called me up and said you should have a look at a section of the Act, the non-consensual use of patient data and potentially its commercial exploitation. We looked at that, or I looked at that, and it did indeed seem to us that that was going to happen. So we set up MedConfidential. The data systems which the GPs and other doctors use are constructed in such a way that there are multiple attempts to take that information, which may appropriately be shared, you know, along care pathways in order to help a person. You know, these are being diverted into what are called secondary uses.
Medical data is some of the most sensitive data it's possible to have. It represents milestones in people's lives. It represents their psychological, social, physical well-being. Any corporate entity that wants to do medical research or be a part of modernising the NHS by digitising it and offering technological solutions, of course that data is really no less than a gold mine. Google DeepMind was given 1.6 million identifiable patient records by the Royal Free NHS Trust unlawfully. 5 years of their patient data in the hands of Google.
Companies from around the world, new industries even, that would seek to access the medical records of the British population because they can then come up with various business models and what have you. They will be selling those products in other contexts as well, other countries.
Assumptions are being made about us now at an ever more granular level based on the amount of data available about us. And this is happening on a terrifying scale. Data exploitation from our phones, from our use of the internet, and so on. When you put health data into that picture, and not just health data, but biometric data and genomic data, really what that would do is commodify the very essence of human beings.
One example of data exploitation is that of commercial baby goodie bag provider Bounty, which had access to maternity wards in NHS hospitals. In 2019, they were fined £400,000 for selling patient information to marketing and credit reference agencies. Medical records provide the basis upon which private health insurers set premiums and decide whether to fund treatment. Behind the scenes, the insurance industry has also been given access to NHS patient data.
We all have a really high level of trust, I think, that the NHS is acting in our interests. That trust will really be flipped on its head if we have more private and corporate involvement.
For each wave of privatisation we see in the world, there is a particular narrative. So we saw the transition from communism, as some countries in the world had their public services taken over by the private sector and shut down. In the third world, we had the debt crisis as the rationale for privatisation. And for Europe, we've been given a narrative called austerity.
The weakest and the poorest are asked to bail out the ones who were stinking rich until yesterday, but who are now profoundly bankrupt as a result of the hubris of their own creation. In 2008, there was a cynical shift of private losses from the books of the banks onto the shoulders of the weakest taxpayers. That's austerity.
Prior to the crisis in 2008, Naomi Klein, the Canadian author, had published a book called Shock Doctrine. And she described how typically those who are promoting austerity, a very small role for government, take advantage of disasters, of crises. We anticipated, based on what she and others had written, that people would use the financial crisis to argue for austerity, to say, essentially, the money has run out, even though the empirical evidence was very clear that, in fact, you should be investing in the economy to get growth at a time of recession. But unfortunately, the austerity narrative was accepted.
All three political parties, main parties, moving to the right. And so the language of the economy is like the Prime Minister's purse in her handbag. If you haven't got the money, you can't spend it. We must be prudent. Fixing the roof while the sun's shining. All that kind of language becomes normal. And you also talk about immigration again and again and again. How everything would be fine if you could cut immigrants to tens of thousands. Everything to dissuade people from looking at what the real problem is.
In 2010, UK debt was 56% of national income. By August 2018, after 8 years of austerity, it had risen to over 84%.
We've had austerity on a par with Greece. The Greek austerity was forced on Greece by Brussels and by Germany and by the Troika and so on. It wasn't their choice. In the UK, we've chosen to do it to ourselves.
It is standard as part of privatisation for government to deliberately run down the public service for several years before the privatisation finalises, in order that the public will feel that there is a step up as the private sector comes in.
The average funding increase over the years for the NHS up to 1997 was about around 3% a year. Now, under the Labour government, it averaged 6% a year. Under the Tory Lib Dem coalition, it went down to 1% a year.
There was copious funding put in place to ease the reorganisations into place. But now that we're in the final stages of privatisation, money is very tight indeed, because that makes the service look worse, and it will make the public want to give up on the NHS and switch to American-style healthcare.
Funding of healthcare goes to people. It means we have fewer doctors, fewer nurses and fewer hospital beds. There is no way you can provide adequate service when you don't have enough of those people and those resources.
Ambulance drivers, the guy who gives you information at the train station, people who clean the streets. I mean, those guys had to take a cut. Nurses had to take a cut. The guys who actually caused the crash didn't have to take a cut.
If anybody's in doubt that austerity is a terrible idea, just look at Greece. Greece is the world champion of austerity. We've practiced more austerity in Greece than any country in the world over the last 300 years, during peacetime or wartime. The result is a great, great depression, something that Steinbeck would describe as the grapes of wrath. We have tens of thousands of suicides. We have people that are so depressed that their health diminishes. We have children that faint at school from malnutrition. This is the bitter harvest of austerity.
We have a large programme of work which looks at patterns of mortality, death rates across Europe, and we saw that something rather strange was happening in the United Kingdom. And when we drilled down, we could see that there was a very large peak of deaths in January 2015. Now, we know that there are excess deaths every winter in the UK, much more than in other countries for a number of reasons, but this really did seem to be quite exceptional. That it coincided with a whole range of measures of performance in the NHS, which were really looking very bad. There was a massive spike in the number of people who were waiting in emergency departments for over 4 hours. There was problems with delayed discharge. And when we looked at the timing of all of these things, they all seemed to come together. We thought that there was probably about 30,000 more deaths than we would have expected.
We've seen since 2012, 2013, the previous increases in life expectancy, which occurred almost every year, begin to reduce, and then most recently almost disappear entirely. So life expectancy across the UK has plateaued. At the same time, and connected, infant mortality rates, which had been coming down very regularly, began to slow down, and then stopped coming down, and then actually began to rise significantly in the last 2 years.
I think what was interesting was the reaction that came to that, because certainly the Department of Health were not very happy to see this, and they described it as a triumph of ideology over research, which we thought was very disappointing.
We ruled every possible cause out, and we're left with the most plausible cause, being austerity and the cuts.
Mum wasn't very well for a long time. She had anemia. She wasn't eating, lost lots of weight. She was having very loose bowel movements and collapsing. And one day she was really bad and we had to call an ambulance. So she was then taken to QE where they examined her. And basically she was sent home and told to come back on the Monday. Well, he didn't want to send her home, but basically he was told that he couldn't admit her. So he didn't really have a choice.
3 days after being sent home, and despite having severe anemia, Mrs. Charker collapsed again and was rushed to the same hospital with intense abdominal pain. There was a further 7 hours delay before her perforated bowel was finally diagnosed. She died later that day.
If we knew that she was going to go as quick as she did, there's obviously things you want to say, and you know, for her as well, sort of thing.
We're here today because we want to get justice for our mother who died 20 months ago, and there needs to be questions that are answered, which we're not happy about. So today, hopefully, we'll get answers.
And there never seems to be enough beds, there doesn't seem to be enough staff. In her hour of need, the NHS weren't there for her, and yet she'd gone all them years not using the NHS.
I sometimes am not able to admit patients that I know need admitting because there aren't enough beds, because beds are being closed at an alarming rate across the country. I don't agree with that, but I'm the one that has to tell the patient they can't come into hospital.
10 medical authors produced an estimate that said if things had carried on to improving, as they had been for the last 4 decades, and as they were in the rest of Europe, 120,000 people would not have died prematurely. In 2015 alone, we saw a spike of 30,000 excess deaths and increasing deaths. The people who work out pensions for private pension funds have calculated that they're going to save billions, huge numbers of billions, on the pensions they no longer have to pay out. Look at the infant mortality, the neonatal mortality rate. We're now down to 19th. That was before the last 2 years where we saw the first absolute rise twice since during the Second World War.
Why is it that certain deaths are like all over the front pages and other deaths are just not something that we'd ever even talk about? How many people have been found fit to work and cut from benefits and found dead within a month or two later? It's in the thousands at this point.
What I find really hard to understand is why government should choose to neglect, why government should think it's okay to see rising numbers of elderly people dying 1 year, 2 years, 3 years before they would have otherwise died. Why government doesn't care that more parents are having to grieve a baby who's died. Either they've backed themselves into a hole and they feel so embarrassed that they can't get out of it, or some of them think this is a price worth paying.
So that we've never voted on the privatisation of the health service. It's just happened in subterfuge. It's happened by demonising people who work in the health service, like the junior doctors who are presented as not wanting to give up their weekends. I mean, what a lie that is. That nurses and ancillary workers have no pay rises, and if they want even to keep up their standard of living, they're painted as greedy.
This is a job that I love. I wouldn't want to do another job. But when you are coming home every day, exhausted, emotionally, physically, financially, increasingly, you start to weigh up whether or not it's worth it.
In a survey of junior doctors by the Royal College of Physicians, 70% worked on a rota that was permanently understaffed. 80% felt their work put them under excessive stress, and a quarter felt it had a serious impact on their mental health.
The clinical commissioning groups, the state-owned insurance pools on which the new system is based, are officially under the control of GPs. So it's GPs that are going to be scapegoated when the system fails to provide any healthcare in the future. The insurance industry has contributed the man who now heads the NHS, the independent NHS, which takes very little instruction from government. And that man is Simon Stevens of the American insurance company United Health.
Simon Stevens was the guy who was president of United's global operations. These are very big parts of these big corporations that are not widely understood. And they're looking to see how they can get enmeshed into the healthcare systems of other countries. The UK in particular, they had a presence in the UK for many years. They operate behind the scenes. They're usually behind the scenes consultants to the Prime Minister or someone in his or her cabinet to advise them one way or another. And of course, if they are coming out of a big for-profit insurance corporation in the US, they have a bias. HMO stands for Health Maintenance Organization. For a good number of years, it didn't have a negative connotation. But when the big for-profit insurance companies began to buy them up and enroll, and in fact, more or less force people into HMOs, they did it in a very ham-fisted way. And there was a big pushback against HMOs, and it came to have a very negative connotation.
We have now narrowed down the Vice President's problems on this thing to one issue, and that is whether we should include these health maintenance organizations like Edgar Kaiser's Permanente thing. Now let me ask you, you can give me your turn. You know I'm not too keen on any stand-up orders. This is a private enterprise one. Well, that's good. Edgar Kaiser is running the Permanente deal for profit. And the reason he can do it, I had Edgar Kaiser come in and talk to me about this, and I went into it in some depth. All of the incentives are toward less medical care, because the less care they give them, the more money they make. And the incentives are in the right way. Okay.
I am proposing today a new national health strategy. The purpose of this program is simply this. I want America to have the finest health care in the world. And I want every American to be able to have that care when he needs it.
Because of the negative connotation of HMOs, a more recent acronym is ACO, which stands for Accountable Care Organizations. And they're similar, there's some differences, but they essentially are pretty much what the old HMOs were.
In 2014, Stevens produced his 5-year forward view, presented as a modernisation plan for the NHS. But in reality, it's a blueprint to take us to the American healthcare system model. We will have the mass closure of hospitals and the formation of provider chains and networks of hospitals, which will be taken over by corporations. In primary care, we will see mass closure of surgeries, down from over 8,000 surgeries in 2010 to around 1,500. And the staff are also being prepared for privatisation. We're seeing the wages slashed and also downskilling, replacing qualified staff with less qualified staff. The result will be a cheaper workforce for their new employers. And all this vandalism is being paid for by the taxpayer.
At the moment, there is quite intensive marketing of private health insurance schemes to various people, and it's perhaps becoming increasingly tempting to go for that as the headlines come out explaining how awful the NHS is these days. The downside of it, of course, is that if you are seriously ill, the health insurers aren't interested in you at all, and you can't even get insurance. So during this transitional phase, a special arrangement called Personal Health Budgets has been set up, which is intended to make sure that people who are seriously ill don't go anywhere near trying to get care from insurance companies.
The American health insurers are already here. Since 2003, United Health Group, and through its subsidiary Optum, has been awarded NHS contracts across England to provide prescribing decision support software, management of GP referrals to hospitals, and crucially, to implement policy to redesign the NHS. United Health Optum is ideally positioned to capture control of NHS budgets allocated to GPs via their registered patient lists. Most doctors remain unaware of the privatisation plan for the NHS, which remarkably is fully endorsed by the British Medical Association. Stevens' NHS long-term plan will complete the transition to the American system, introducing financial incentives to deny patients care through a shared savings scheme copying United Health's own shared savings program.
Many of the changes that this plan sets out are already happening somewhere in the NHS, and now they need to happen everywhere across the NHS.
All of the incentives are toward less medical care, because the less care they give them, the more money they make.
What work have you done that will ensure that that work is continued to really be done by the NHS? Or is NHS just going to become a badge?
No. We are suggesting that the integrated care should be public providers.
I'm just going to be much more concrete, right? There's no privatisation of the NHS on my watch, and the integrated care contracts will go to public sector bodies to deliver the NHS in public hands.
Look, I think everything with a trade deal is on the table. When you're dealing in trade, everything's on the table. So NHS or anything else, or a lot more than that, but everything will be on the table, absolutely.
The ultimate game for the insurance industry in taking control of the NHS is to ruin it, because it's unpleasant competition.
Their aim is the American model, massively inefficient, massively divisive, massively unequal.
Simon Stevens will be there presiding over the breakdown of the system and Controlling public opinion so that blame is never placed in the correct place, that people see the NHS as failing them, as not fit for purpose, and become keener and keener on putting money in the direction of his old bosses, the American insurance industry.
When there is no paediatric service available at the local hospital and the worried parent has to try and drive 40 miles with an unwell child in the back of a car, the difference between waiting for an ambulance in a rural community and waiting for one in a city is very different. And when you have a child with meningitis, when you have a critically ill child, the parents are unwilling to wait. And so they bring the child along to the local emergency department where the service is no longer available to support them. Patients are suffering in silence. They don't understand what is going on locally. They can't comprehend that a government would want to try and dismantle the National Health Service. They still have the belief that it exists. They have the belief that it's always there for them.
Per 100,000, the number of deaths in this country is still one of the very worst in the world. How many deaths could have been avoided with quick action in excess of 100,000?
Really?
Right?
Life saved.
Yeah.
Because I know there will be many people looking now at our apparent success.
Leaders from all three main parties have, over the last 30 years, been enabling the corporate capture of the NHS, whilst claiming to support it. The destruction of the nation's finest achievement is the greatest betrayal of the public interest.
When they meet in Davos in Switzerland, that's what they're deciding. These people will be poverty-stricken all their lives, but we will all have the riches. And I have another yacht in the Mediterranean, if you don't mind.
It's a tragedy, but it's a tragedy of our own making if we don't change it. Nye Bevan said, National Health Service will exist as long as there are people to fight for it. The question is, do we have the stomach to fight for it?
You can't sit idly by whilst, I believe, people are suffering. That's not why I became a doctor. I became a doctor to help people. I became a doctor because I want to look after people in the best possible way. And mostly I wanted to be a doctor in the NHS because I can make those decisions without ever having to think about how much that person earns or insurance qualifications. Now that I see that being threatened and the quality of care being compromised, I felt like it's my duty to tell people and inform people what is happening.
Find your local groups, talk to each other, build, because what you will be is a ripple that will ripple out and make waves and get bigger and louder and grow stronger. And there will then be an overwhelming tidal wave demanding that our NHS is being brought back into public ownership, publicly provided, publicly delivered and accountable for all. Thank you so much for coming, you're wonderful.
Demoralisation amongst health service workers is desperate, and I think what's really necessary is that doesn't subside into walking away. You know, we need people to stay there and make their anger constructive.
They haven't been able to break people's commitment to the basic principle, and even the most noxious right-wing politicians for the most part, feel they have to pay lip service to those ideals. So there's something there that they can't break in people's spirits. They know that if they openly say what they're going to do, there will be an enormous backlash.
You want any comment? No? No? Why not? Isn't this what you had planned? If you got in within 5 years, no more NHS? Nothing to say about that?
The mass mobilisation that we saw to save Lewisham Hospital needs to be replicated across the country for everybody's hospitals. And that's very hard, but people need to make the effort to do that.
It is critical to have a victory. It doesn't really matter what it is. So the first thing you should always do is set your sights on something you can actually achieve in a relatively short period of time. And the moment you have one victory, everything changes.
I got leaked information, I think it was in 2011, that they were going to shut down the service and not reopen it. We had a huge following on the social networks. We mobilized them, and then the trust got rattled. We got huge press coverage, which was totally unfavorable, made the trust look really bad. They backed down.
We have been lied to extensively about the NHS privatisation over decades, and the fact that they have bothered to make up all of those lies suggests that the lies must be pretty important. So please tell everybody you know what's happening to the NHS and why.
You can actually appeal to people's personal selfishness just for them and their family. Forget about society. If you only care about you and your family, you need a decent NHS.
What you want to do is attack the private companies who are already coming into your health services or the ones who are considering doing so. Because the fact is that if they can't turn a profit, they have no interest in troubling us. If you go out and tell the truth to people about it, maybe we'll manage to see these predators off.
We asked the public what they thought about the revolving door. And we asked them, first of all, should government ministers accept boardroom jobs? 75% said that is a practice that should be banned.
Eliminate the direct effect of consultancies on public policy making and on political parties.
And we tell ourselves we're a democracy, but we never practice democracy. Most people have no experience. They don't even know what it would be like to sit around with 20 other people and making collective decisions together in a way that isn't imposed by some leader. Now that sort of stuff is transformative. When you start getting involved in movements that organize themselves in a model of the kind of society you'd like to see, even in very small ways, it changes your sense of social possibility.
Speeding through the invisible 20%. Watch our race between the guilty and the innocent. Rubbing shoulders with the super class engines. Burning up the Urals in South Kensington. Choking up another fire, smoking on the air. Something should rather be anywhere but here.
You cannot compromise on the needs of people, which are what? Is secure job, looking after when you're sick, pension when you're old, good education for your kids, a home to live in. And those are now revolutionary demands because the system can't provide it. So make those demands, stick to them, and we can change the world.
We are on the brink of losing our NHS, and the only way we're going to get it back is if public, patients and professionals get together. We need to use civil disobedience, mass mobilisation to win back our NHS.
I think having a system like that where you have that available to you just as a standard as a country is wonderful. But I certainly wouldn't change it and go to a system like we have here because I really don't think you'd be happy.
The city is blind, but it will not slow down. The drive to destruction is the heaviest sound. Is the heaviest sound. Is the heaviest sound. Is the heaviest sound.
Caleb, you said you hadn't watched it, so what do you think? Yeah. Right. Yeah, they kind of got the same problem with candidates saying one thing and doing absolutely the opposite, you know? Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Um, one of the things that surprised me is I didn't realize that locums, we use locums here locally for temporary physicians and stuff. They take travel type jobs and stuff and positions, and I didn't know they were international. You know.
Yep, and I've heard they're often strike breakers, and I've heard that with the traveling nurses too, they're often paid
Yep.
well, but they have really often lousy working conditions, and they're harassed or something goes wrong. They don't have much recourse, and they can be paid well but really exploited.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. Hey Deb, it's good to see you. I know you have lots of knowledge about Cuba and their healthcare system, and it's horrifying what's going on with them right now that our country is putting them through.
Right. I mean, they had one of the best healthcare systems in the world, and it's, the ideals are there, the desire is there, but because of the blockade, especially the more recent oil blockade, they just don't have anything